Well, once you hear it, and I've seen this with live audiences, I've shared this with live audiences, and I've got the visuals to go with it. And the visuals are so powerful because when I can show atoms, what we now know is that atoms, are we still on camera?
We are, but don't worry.
I don't know if you want this or not.
Yeah.
But what we now know is when I was in school and when many of our listeners were in school, we were taught that this is a physical reality made of atoms. And our atoms would look like little solar systems. They were modeled as little solar systems, things in the middle called a nucleus with other things orbiting them like electrons. And those days are long gone. We now look at atoms rather than things orbiting around other things. We look at them as concentrations of energy in space and time where there are no clear-cut things. Now where this gets important is that scientists, and this is in the standard physics textbooks, this is no surprise what I'm about to say, is that if you change the field of energy that the atom lives in, you change the atom. You can change that field electrically, or you can change it magnetically. And there are terms for the effects. The Zeeman effect, the Stark effect are well-documented effects of electrical and magnetic changes in the field that change the atom. Or while it sounds technical and maybe not relevant, where it gets really relevant very fast, is our hearts are the strongest bioelectrical and magnetic field generators in our bodies. Our hearts generate stronger electrical fields than our brains. They generate stronger magnetic fields than our brains. Our hearts are 5,000 times as powerful magnetically than our brains. And we hear about EKGs of our hearts. They're up to 100 times stronger than the EEG, the electrical information in our brains. So when we create thoughts, feelings, emotions, beliefs, compassion, prayers of forgiveness in our hearts, that's the words that we call those experiences. But to the field, what we're doing is we're creating electrical and magnetic waves in here that are now known to change the stuff out here. And in that way, we are linked. So when we talk about our universe, possibly as a simulation, it tells us that we are not separate, that we are empowered not to control or manipulate or impose our will, rather to participate, as Princeton physicist John Wheeler suggests, to participate in the way this reality unfolds, to participate in our personal growth and healing, in the healing of our loved ones, to participate in the peace that happens in our families and between nations. And the little catch is that for us to share the beauty of this participation, we must work together and share those heart fields. And that, I think, is where this learning curve is actually going. And we may not use that language. We don't have to understand all the technical aspects. I mean, people know that when you have a feeling, it may have an effect. But in our Western world, we need our mind, our left brain, our logic needs a framework to hang these very subtle spiritual understandings upon. We'd like to believe them, we just need a reason to believe it. And the reasons are there. If we can take the understandings out of the very technical realm and share them in a language that's relevant to people that don't have that background. Science is only a language. It's a good language. It's only one language that describes our world. And there are many other languages, and I think for me this is the value of going into the monasteries of Tibet and Bolivia and Peru and Nepal. We've been in monasteries in Egypt, in their libraries, their records. For 1,500 years, people who have lived the traditions and perpetuated and taught them, because we can look at them. I can look at another human, eye to eye, heart to heart, God to God, in that moment, directly or through a translator. And I can ask them, human to human, I can say, when you just did that miraculous healing, what happened in your body to make that happen? How'd you do that? And if I don't understand what they say, I can ask them again and again and again until they either kick me out of the monastery because they're tired of my questions, or they will answer my question. And in this way, we learn from this 5,000-year-old heritage of our past, and we marry that with the best science of our day today. In the book Small Miracles, there's an amazing story. It's a true story, and I share it with our audiences a lot, of what many people would call a miracle. And for me, it's a demonstration of just how real this field is that connects everything. It's a story of a young Jewish boy. His name was Joey, who at the age, I believe, of 19, suddenly woke up one morning and began to question 5,000 years of Jewish tradition. He began to question all of the things he'd been taught by his family, and his father took it as a personal offense. He said, "How can you question this lineage of wisdom and tradition?" And Joey said, "I've got to go out in the world and find out for myself if these things are true or not." And his father said, "If you turn your back on your tradition and you go out in the world and search for yourself," he said, "you're no longer my son. I have no son." And Joey said, "I've got to do this." And he left. And he went into the world and he studied in the ancient and the Eastern traditions, Buddhist traditions, and the Jewish traditions. And he was in a small cafe, and I believe it was in Paris. And you never know who's going to walk into those cafes. And a friend of his walked in from the States that he hadn't seen since he left. And the first thing his friend said was, "I was so sorry, Joey, to hear about the death of your father." And it was the first Joey knew that his father had died. And so he immediately came back to the States and he began speaking to his father's friends and their neighbors. And what he found is, rather than turning his back on his son, his father had done just the opposite. He was so proud of his son for having the strength to question 5,000 years of faith. And he spoke about his son incessantly and honored his son's courage. And this led Joey back into the Jewish tradition that he had left to explore. And it eventually led him in a traditional pilgrimage to the Holy Wall in Jerusalem. And if you've ever seen this wall, you know that it's made out of these massive stone bricks that have been there for so long that the mortar holding them together has fallen out. So where the mortar used to be, there are empty spaces, and the tradition is to inscribe a prayer on a paper or a cloth rolled up and place your prayer into that wall. And this is what Joey was doing. He'd written a prayer to his father asking for his father's forgiveness for the pain that he'd caused and the suffering in the family. And he was pacing back and forth in front of the wall looking for just the right place where he would leave his prayer. And there was a place that caught his eye, and as he was raising his hand to put his prayer into that place, the moment that he did that, another prayer that was already in there somehow magically fell out at his feet. And as he reached down to pick up the prayer that had fallen out, it was already partially unrolled, and he already recognized what was happening here. It was a prayer in his father's handwriting that his father had written before his death and had come to precisely the same place and put in precisely that crevice in the wall that Joey had been drawn to. And as Joey read the prayer, it was a prayer from his father to God, asking for forgiveness for turning his back on his son and how much he really loved his son and how proud of his son he was. And the reason I share the story, for two reasons. First of all, when we hear the story, there's a feeling within us. I feel it every time I share it. That feeling is a language. It's a nonverbal language. And if I just simply said to you or to an audience, have that feeling right now, you might be hard-pressed to do it because there's no reason to have the feeling. But when we hear stories like that, that feeling came from a place of innocence, of emptiness, of non-judgment. You didn't know what was going to happen, but you feel a feeling when you hear that story. Number one. Number two, for Joey to find precisely the crevice in the wall where his father had been months before his death. There obviously, and for him to be there that moment and for that prayer to fall out of the wall at his feet, and this is a true story, there obviously was a communication that was not bound by time or space, or in this case, even life and death. It was a message from beyond his father's life in this world. And for that to happen, there's got to be a conduit that carries that message. That's the divine matrix. That's the field that we're talking about.